I'm just curious as we get started today, and there's actually a reason for this question, believe it or not, but how many of you, when you were young, collected comic books? Ah, yeah. Now, how many of you still collect comic books? Yeah. Yeah, well, I collected comic books like most kids, and I actually still collect comic books. It's one of my hobbies. But when I was a little kid, probably the first comic book I got was when I was maybe 4 or 5 years old. At that time, we were living in a small town in the state of West Virginia, a town called Montgomery. And in this town is West Virginia Institute of Technology, and my father was the chairman of the physics department at WVIT. And it was a small town, and I remember going downtown with my mother and my father quite often. And at the local drugstore was the newsstand, and that's where you bought comic books. And a number of years ago, that's where comic books were sold, were at newsstands. And so I can remember every time I would go into the drugstore with my parents, I would beg them to give me money to buy a comic book. Now, as I mentioned, we lived in a little town called Montgomery, and my father was a professor at West Virginia Institute of Technology, and just for fun, this is an iconic image of the WVIT campus. And we lived in faculty housing, which was just adjacent to the campus. So as a little kid, the campus was my playground. And one of my favorite places to play was in front of the administration building. And so you can't see it in this picture, but there's a long flight of stairs that leads up to that landing. And then from that landing, another long flight of stairs that goes up to the entrance of the administration building. And on the right is the science building. And so my father's office was on the first floor of the science building. So as a little kid, I could go onto that lawn, beautiful terraced lawn, and spend my afternoons playing while my father was in his office. And one of the first things I learned on a college campus was that college students are slobs. They would leave trash everywhere on this beautiful terraced lawn, including pop bottles. And so as a little kid, I would collect pop bottles, and I would carry them to a local market called Fannon's Market that was near our house, and I could cash them in a nickel for a pop bottle, which meant if I got 2 pop bottles, I could get a dime, which was enough to buy a candy bar. So I would spend a lot of time scouring the campus looking for pop bottles so I could cash them in for candy bars. Well, one day I was in Fannon's Market, and he had huge stacks of comic books that he was selling for a penny a piece, not 15 cents like I had to pay at the drugstore, a penny a piece. The one thing is that none of the comics had covers, right? And so I didn't care as a little kid because a comic book was a comic book. And so now I was collecting pop bottles so I could buy comic books. And I very quickly accumulated a very large collection. Now I discovered that what Mr. Fannon was doing was actually illegal, because in those days, if a newsstand didn't sell a magazine or a comic book, they would tear the cover off and mail back the cover to the distributor as proof that they didn't sell that issue. Right? And so they were supposed to dispose of the comic books or the magazines, but Mr. Fannon figured out a way to get those comic books before they were disposed of and turned it into a little side hustle. I didn't care because it allowed me to have a very large comic book collection. But anyway, all that to say is that through that process, I became exposed to a number of superheroes, right? And in the 1960s, in the mid-1960s, this was when Marvel Comics was introducing some of their iconic characters, like Spider-Man, the Fantastic Four, the Hulk, right? Iron Man, and the list goes on and on, Thor. And so the comics that I was getting were some of the very early issues of those iconic, comic lines. I didn't realize it at the time, and it wouldn't have been worth anything because none of my comic books had covers. But nevertheless, I fell in love with comic books as a result of that experience. And as I got older, I stopped collecting comic books like most people do until 2007, right? When the Marvel Cinematic Universe began with the release of the very first Iron Man movie, right? And I was fascinated to see the movie because I wanted to know how are they going to translate Iron Man that I knew from the comics to Iron Man on the big screen, and they did an incredible job. But Iron Man has always been one of my favorite comic book superheroes. And as I later learned, the Iron Man character in the Iron Man comics, even though these were written for kids and for young adults, were actually very sophisticated treatments of the relationship between human beings and technology, right? And so Iron Man is an interesting character because when Larry Lieber and Stan Lee created Iron Man, they wanted to create a modern-day knight. That was their vision. So, Iron Man has this high-tech armor. But they also wanted to have a little fun with their audience because they wanted to create this character who was beloved because he was a hero, but also was reviled because of his business interests. And so Tony Stark was meant to be this less than sympathetic alter ego for Iron Man. He was a billionaire playboy, actually modeled after Howard Hughes. And he was a weapons manufacturer, right? Stark Enterprises manufactured weapons. And at that time, he had been part of the military-industrial complex. And during the 60s, that was when the Vietnam conflict was happening, very unpopular military action. And so many of the Marvel readers would have been very unsympathetic, would have disliked Tony Stark. So interesting play there. But in the Iron Man comics, again, a lot of themes that are deep themes related to the philosophy of technology are played out. So, for example, one idea is that technology makes us vulnerable as human beings, that we develop technology to help to improve our lives, to make us more efficient, more effective, to minimize labor, but we can actually become vulnerable as a result of the technology that we create because we become dependent upon it. And so, as many of you are familiar with Iron Man, he has that repulsor plate embedded in his chest. It's generating a magnetic field to keep the shrapnel out of his heart. Well, in the early Iron Man comics, he had to plug that in every 24 hours and recharge it. And if he didn't, he would actually die. So the repulsor plate that powered the armor that made him a superhero actually made him vulnerable as well. He was dependent upon that technology for his very life. Another theme is our addiction to technology, that we're never satisfied as human beings with technology. We want better and better and better technology. And of course, with Tony Stark, we always see him upgrading the armor, trying to make it better. But there's a famous Iron Man story arc called Demon in a Bottle, where Tony Stark is revealed to be an alcoholic, which was meant to be a metaphor for our addiction to technology. And then lastly, there's an issue of identity, right? One of the themes in Iron Man is, where does Iron Man end and Tony Stark begin? And in fact, Tony Stark is obsessed with, over time, integrating the armor into his biological makeup so that he begins to lose his identity as a human being. And again, many philosophers of technology question what impact on our identity does technology have, right? But perhaps the overarching theme that you see in Iron Man is this notion of techno-faith, right? This is an idea that the way in which we are going to improve our lives, the way in which we're going to solve some of the most pressing problems that we experience as human beings, the way that we are going to save ourselves is through science and the technology that emerges out of science. That the idea is that, and this is an idea that is birthed in the Enlightenment, that we can become lords and masters of nature, to quote Descartes, right? That we can understand the world, and through that understanding and the technology we develop, bend the world around us to our desires, right? And this is all an embodiment of techno-faith. A philosopher of technology named George Dunn says this: "The enduring appeal of Iron Man owes a great deal to how Tony Stark personifies the spectacular promise of technology to turn our dreams into reality, a promise that has stoked a fire in the bellies of countless men and women in the modern era, not just pre-adolescent boys with airborne imaginations. Tony epitomizes the dream of technology enhancing human powers far beyond the limits of our natural endowment." Right? And so in many respects, you could argue that Iron Man is the quintessential transhumanist superhero. Right? That Iron Man embodies this notion of techno-faith, and transhumanism takes this notion of techno-faith and manifests it to the greatest degree of any philosophical movement I'm aware of. And as we mentioned last night, transhumanism is this idea that we have a moral obligation to use technology to modify our biological makeup as human beings, to overcome our limitations, to correct the flaws that are part of our biological makeup, and in doing so, enhance ourselves beyond our natural limits, making us stronger, more intellectually adept, more psychologically well-adjusted. And many people that hold to a transhumanist view argue that human beings have been the product of an evolutionary history, and as a result of our evolutionary history, we are riddled with flaws. We are limited. And as a result of that, there is pain and suffering that is a manifestation of the errors in our biology and the limitations of our biology. And that if we can overcome these limits, if we can correct these errors, that we can mitigate pain and suffering in the world. This is the one of the fundamental driving forces behind transhumanism. Some transhumanists will go even further and argue that, look, we are a product of evolution, and we're going to continue to evolve as human beings. And so if that's the case, why not take control of our own evolution and evolve ourselves into post-human species that would be perfectly adapted for the technological-driven world that we are in the process of creating? The idea here, again, is human beings evolved in a primitive state. We were initially hunter-gatherers, and that we are not well-suited for a technological world. And so we need to evolve ourselves into this collection of post-human species. And in fact, there are some people who argue that we could even use the technology to extend human life expectancy to a practical immortality. That this is the means by which we can potentially live, quote unquote, forever as human beings. This is how James Hughes describes transhumanism in his book Citizen Cyborg. In the 21st century, the convergence of artificial intelligence, nanotechnology, and genetic engineering will allow human beings to achieve things previously imagined only in science fiction. Lifespans will extend well beyond a century. Our senses and cognition will be enhanced. We will gain control over our emotions and memory. We will merge with machines, and machines will become more like humans. These technologies will allow us to evolve into varieties of post-humans and usher us into a transhuman era in society. Transhuman technologies that push the boundaries of humanism, can radically improve our quality of life, and we have a fundamental right to use them to control our bodies and our minds. That is the transhumanist vision in a nutshell. Now, even though transhumanism is oftentimes presented as a philosophical idea that is deeply embedded within science and technology, in many respects, it is actually a religious idea. Because many people who are transhumanists, not everyone, but many people who are transhumanists are atheists. They are materialists. And they recognize in that framework that when human beings die, that's it. You no longer exist. When the human species becomes extinct, we're gone forever, right? And in that atheistic worldview, there is no hope. There is no purpose. There is no destiny to individuals or to humanity as a species, right? It's a nihilistic view of things. It's a depressing view of the future, right? But with transhumanism, you now have some measure of hope, purpose, and destiny. That if you can actually use technology to extend our life expectancy to at least a practical immortality, you overcome the greatest limitation that every human being has, which is the finiteness of our physical existence, right? That is the biggest limitation that we all face, that humanity faces. And so with transhumanism, we now have this opportunity to, again, have genuine hope, purpose, and destiny, where science and technology becomes now the means by which we have salvation, the means by which we attain a type of eternal life. Now, this idea of transhumanism has been around for a long time, believe it or not. It's not a new idea by any means. In fact, maybe the first expression of transhumanism was in the early 1900s in a book written by J.B.S. Haldane called The Atlas, where he was speculating. Haldane, by the way, was one of the founders of the discipline of genetics. And he was speculating that one day we're going to have such an understanding of human genetics that we will be able to, through genetics, to create human beings that have precise, specific characteristics and capabilities that would be perfectly suited for the needs of society, right? And that we could even develop artificial wombs that would allow us to reproduce independent of the human organism. Now, if that sounds familiar, it was actually the basis for Huxley's Brave New World, right? It was the inspiration for Huxley's Brave New World. So this idea has been around for a long time, but nobody took it seriously as a legitimate academic idea. It was always viewed as being fringe until the last decade or so, where we're seeing advances in a number of areas of biotechnology that suddenly give legitimacy to transhumanism. As I mentioned last night, we now have the ability with CRISPR gene editing to do high precision manipulation of genomes. And as a result of this, we can now use this technology to treat genetic diseases, maybe even cure genetic diseases. But the same technology that can be used to treat genetic disorders can also be used to create designer babies and to genetically enhance human beings. There's also advances in anti-aging technology. And this is not snake oil stuff anymore, but we now have enough of an understanding of the biology of aging that there are biogerontologists that believe that we can not only arrest the aging process, we can actually reverse it. And there are biologists that are now arguing that we need to think about aging like we think about any other disease. And if it is a disease, then it means that we can treat it and cure it. But there are actually small-scale clinical trials that have been successful where people have developed different anti-aging approaches and have actually reversed the chronological or the biological age of individuals in the studies. In both clinical studies that I'm aware of, it was a 2-year study, and after 2 years, the test subjects were 2 years younger biologically than their chronological age. successfully reversing the aging process. People like Aubrey de Grey are arguing that we very well could extend human life expectancy on the order of several hundreds of years in the near future, that this is something that's within our grasp. And then finally, there are advances that are happening in brain-computer interface technology. And I want to talk a little bit about these advances. And the idea here is that you can embed these electronic devices into patients' or test subjects' brains, and they can either learn to control computer hardware and software with their thoughts, or now we're seeing techniques where people are applying machine learning algorithms, basically AI, to extract user intent from the electrical activity in the brain, and then the brain-computer interface is essentially affecting computer software or computer hardware. But this is going to revolutionize how we treat, for example, patients that are amputees, because we can, these patients can learn to control robotic prosthetic limbs with their thoughts. And in fact, the patients report that over time they actually develop a sense of ownership of the robotic limb, where they now see that limb as actually a part of themselves. These brain-computer interfaces can be used for quadriplegic and paraplegic patients, so they can again control exoskeletons with their thoughts, granting them mobility. And there's been some interesting work done with patients that are locked in, where through the use of brain-computer interface technology, patients that have suffered from a brain injury, for example, or from a stroke, can actually, and no longer can communicate with their thoughts. And one study actually involved a single patient who was 61 years old, who was a quadriplegic and locked in for a couple of decades. And they actually, through a brain-computer interface and machine learning, asked the patient to imagine writing out letters. And they were actually able to record the electrical activity in the brain, and through a training process, were able to actually demonstrate that the machine learning algorithm as the output was actually recording actual letters. And so through this technology, the patient was able to text at a rate that is comparable to how you and I would text. And through the use of autocorrect, there's almost like a 95% accuracy, which is remarkable. Of course, everybody is familiar with Elon Musk. He needs no introduction. But one of the companies that Elon Musk founded a few years ago now is called Neuralink. I think Neuralink maybe was founded in 2016. And the vision of Neuralink is to build a brain-computer interface. And in fact, the brain-computer interface that Neuralink has produced is considered to be beyond the state of the art, like everything Elon Musk does. So people that work in this area have said what they have produced is this incredibly advanced brain-computer interface. And in fact, they are now progressing the brain-computer interface they developed into small-scale clinical trials. I think there's been 2 or 3 patients now that have received the Neuralink interface. So this is something that Elon Musk is actively working on as part of this whole BCI process. But interestingly enough, Elon Musk is not only interested in humanitarian purposes, but he's also interested in using these brain-computer interfaces as the next interface between human beings and all the electronic devices that are around us. We're now familiar that with many of these devices, we can issue a voice command and get what we want. The thought is that with these brain-computer interfaces, if we commercialize them, we can actually control electronic devices around us with our thoughts. And in fact, Elon Musk sees an existential need for brain-computer interfaces because he's very concerned about AI technology. And his argument is that unless we are able to interface the human brain with computer systems, humans are never going to have the capability of keeping up, of being competitive with the AI systems that we're building. And as a result, we could either be subjugated by these AI overlords or wind up essentially becoming extinct. And so he sees an urgency in creating these interfaces as a way to help us overcome the challenge and the threat of AI. And so he has become, in effect, a reluctant transhumanist with his company Neuralink. I just realized I have a video here. I'm not sure if this is going to play. It will play, but I don't know if you can hear the sound. Probably not. Okay. If I can I use the microphone and just put it up to the computer? This is a video that's a short clip from a TED Talk given by Jason Sosa. And he is at that time of the TED Talk, was the CEO of a company called Immersive that was looking to commercialize computer brain interfaces. And so let me see if I can play this so that you can hear it.
Computer chips won't just be in your laptop or in your phone. Doctors will implant them in our brains, and they'll restore sight to the blind and hearing to the deaf. Today, there are already 300,000 people with cochlear implants. It's a form of a neural prosthetic that allows certain types of deaf people to hear. And Michio Kaku describes brain implants as your very own augmented mind. And this is the beginning of the brain net, a possible successor to the internet, a form of virtual telepathy that will allow you to create music, drive a car, communicate with other people, and even surf the web at the speed of thought. Movies will no longer be these two-dimensional slate tablets that you look into and blast sound at you. They'll be fully immersive experiences, complete with feeling and emotion the way the director originally intended. Everything is stored, every memory recorded, and available on a cloud service. And mind uploading will allow your friends to share their digital vacation experiences that never actually took place. It all just happened in their mind. Similar to Total Recall.
That there are studies where through brain-computer interface technology, you can actually affect things remotely, right? So you can be sitting here in Toronto and actually play a video game that's in operation in Los Angeles, right? That there are studies where you can actually tether people's brains together with brain-computer interfaces, where in some studies you can have one person thinking about raising the other person's finger, and their finger will raise. Or there was a study done where there were two rats that had their brains tethered together with brain-computer interfaces. One rat was trained to activate a lever and get a reward, get a piece of food. The other rat wasn't. And they put the rat that wasn't trained in a cage with a lever, and the other rat that was trained could see the rat in the cage and actually could communicate to that rat what to do in order to get the reward. And so this is really freaky stuff that these brain-computer interfaces now are going to allow, where the line between reality and what is virtual is going to be blurred, and the ability to communicate with each other is going to happen at lightning speeds, at the speed of thought, as Jason Sosa said, as people are looking to potentially tether brains together. So we really are in a brave new world. And so the point here is that this idea of transhumanism and the capacity of technology to enhance human beings is a reality that's in front of us. This is not something that's going to go away, and that we can't afford to pretend like this is not going to happen, because it is happening before our very eyes. We can't just simply condemn this technology, because this technology can be used for an enormous amount of good. What we have to do is engage the technology. We have to develop a way to interact with what's happening in our culture, in our world, and do it in an effective way, in a way that gives credibility in respect to the Christian worldview and our concerns and our desires to see the technology used in certain ways. This is going to be one of the most important ideas that is confronting us in the next couple of decades. We can't avoid this idea. And in the book Humans 2.0, Ken and I talk about three different areas, where we need to engage transhumanism. One we talked about last night. Many people see this as a threat to the notion of human exceptionalism. The other is all the ethical issues that arise. And hours talking about the ethical issues surrounding brain-computer interfaces simply with respect to their use for medical purposes, let alone their use in enhancing human beings. But we also need to recognize that transhumanism is a potential threat to the gospel, that it is a counter-gospel, it is an alternative to the gospel, because we live in a world that is so strongly influenced by science and technology, where people are increasingly secular, that it makes sense for people to turn to science and technology to solve problems. And as a result of that, to find the message of transhumanism, the notion that technology can allow us to have a practical immortality, people are going to find that very appealing. And so one of our challenges as Christians is, how do we engage transhumanism as a false gospel? How do we engage transhumanism as a false gospel, and in the same way demonstrate to people the relevancy of the gospel of Jesus Christ? And that's what I want to finish the time that I have with you by talking about. And of course, the first question on the table is, can technology save us? Right? And this is where the work that's been done in the philosophy of technology by secular philosophers is very helpful, because most philosophers of technology have a very good, sober sense of how technology can be misused, how it can go wrong, what technology does to the human condition and to our nature as human beings. But one response that is I think a very effective response from the philosophy of technology to this question, can technology save us, is something called the salvation paradox. And the idea here is that with transhumanism, whatever we do to modify human beings with the idea of saving humanity, or whatever we do to each of us as individuals with the idea of trying to extend our life expectancy, is ultimately going to alter us to such a degree that what we save is not us, but what we've created. Right? So think about it this way. If you could imagine a future where you could digitally upload your brain, right, into a machine framework, you've not saved yourself by doing that. What you've done is you've produced a copy of your brain that's now in your mind, your essence, that's now in a machine framework. You're not going to live. The copy of you is going to live, right? And so this is a salvation paradox. Well, or if we modify human beings to create post-human species that are going to live forever, right, quote unquote, what we're doing is not really saving ourselves, right? We're not saving humanity, we're actually driving humanity to extinction. What we're saving is our successor. And so this is what Patrick Hopkins writes. Suppose technology is changing so much that I'm no longer a member of the human species, no longer limited by any species defining human cognitive characteristics. I've changed so much that the existence I now experience is incomprehensible to my former limited human self. As much as that language may sound wonderful, exciting, and liberating at first, thinking about it more in depth reveals that such a technological process offers far less to me than hope. The end result will be some kind of successor entity to me, but it will not be me. And so, for the salvation paradox alone, that should be enough to convince most people that technology cannot save us, that technology can't save us. So then how can we demonstrate the relevancy of the gospel in a coming age where transhumanism is going to be part of our cultural milieu? Well, it's very easy to demonize transhumanists. It's very easy to argue that that transhumanists are a threat to our world, they're a threat to our faith. But think about this. What is it that transhumanists recognize? Well, they recognize that the world isn't the way it's supposed to be, right? That there's pain and suffering in the world, there's injustice in the world, and that they want to step in and do something to mitigate that pain and suffering. They want to create a utopian type of world where there is no injustice. They recognize that death is the enemy, that there's a tragedy when a human being dies, that there's a tragedy to think about humanity becoming extinct. Well, aren't those concerns that we share as Christians? Right? So transhumanists are not the enemies. They are people that are in desperate need of salvation. And what's interesting to me is that so often in my work at Reasons to Believe, I've seen people that use science as a way to erect a barrier to shield them from the gospel. What transhumanism is doing is exposing the deepest need that every human being has, which is for hope, purpose, and destiny. A desire to connect to the transcendent, a desire for salvation. That's what's being expressed by transhumanists. This is an incredible bridge that we can build with transhumanists and a culture that's going to be influenced by transhumanism, is to say we share these concerns. Salvation now becomes a part of the natural conversation in our culture because of transhumanism. That we can build a bridge, and if we can show then that technology is and techno-faith is a false gospel, now we can present to people the true gospel. So there's a golden opportunity here for the gospel to go forth in a world shaped by transhumanism. Ronald Cole Turner, a theologian, writes this: there are notable similarities between Christianity and transhumanism. Christians hope for eternal life that will be enjoyed with the fullest possible knowledge, joy, and moral purity. Transhumanists look forward to extending the human lifespan, perhaps indefinitely, while also enriching human knowledge, attaining greater happiness, if not joy, and achieving moral balance and social harmony. One explanation for these similarities is that transhumanism emerged from a culture shaped by Christianity. Another is that the yearnings of Christians and transhumanists, if not quite universally shared by all human beings, are broadly held and find their own expression in both contexts. And so, again, transhumanism is an incredible opportunity to advance the gospel. A few years ago, I received an invitation from the president of the United States Transhumanist Political Party. Believe it or not, every state in the U.S. has a transhumanist political party, and there's a national party. And I recorded the video on YouTube, and they watched the video, and they thought it was intriguing, so they invited me to come onto a program that the U.S. Transhumanist Party produces called a Virtual Enlightenment Salon. And I was on that show as a Christian with 12 people that were leading transhumanists. And we spent 3.5 hours talking about the relationship between transhumanism and Christianity. And throughout the course of that conversation, I had an opportunity to present the gospel over and over and over again, and it wasn't received as some kind of obnoxious thing that a Christian was doing. that was actually a natural part of our conversation, right? Where the whole question was, where can we find salvation? There's a huge opportunity here. And I'm going to close by making the point that, in a sense, Christianity is the ultimate and the purest expression of transhumanism, right? And so I'm going to close with the words of the Apostle Paul. There are heavenly bodies and there are earthly bodies. The splendor of the heavenly bodies is one kind, the splendor of the earthly bodies is another. The sun has one kind of splendor, the moon another, and the stars another, and stars differ from stars in splendor. So will it be with the resurrection of the dead. The body that is sown is perishable, it is raised imperishable, it is sown in dishonor, it is raised in glory, it is sown in weakness, it is raised in power, it is sown a natural body, it is raised a spiritual body. The hope that we have, that the Apostle Paul expresses in this passage, is exactly the hope that transhumanists desire. So anyway, thank you, and I guess we'll turn the floor over to Don, right?